Hi, everyone. So how many of you love eating oysters? Show of hands. Awesome. Now, how many of you have ever thought about what might happen to oysters in the future and potentially what their experiences when they're young impact them in the future as well? Oh, actually, that's really interesting. Well, I have, which is why my research is looking at how climate change is impacting young oysters and potentially their success in the future. So one aspect of climate change that's impacting oysters is ocean acidification. And ocean acidification is due to the release of fossil fuels that release carbon into, or CO2 into the atmosphere, which is carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide is then dissolved into our waters or our oceans, reacting with water, releasing hydrogen ions. And if we all remember back to our high school chemistry days, that increase in hydrogen ions leads to increasing acidity. So increasing CO2 in our atmospheres leads to increasing ocean acidification, which can be potentially damaging to oysters. But why should we care about oysters when there are other aspects or other shellfish that we can consume? Well, as you may have seen coming, oysters are more than just delicious. They provide us with a plethora of services. One of those services is cleaning the waterways by consuming algae. The other is providing a structure or a habitat for other important species in the bay through their reef formations. Some of those species are the blue crab, the juvenile striped bass. They also provide us with an economic resource through aquaculture and the fishery. They also can protect our shorelines and our homes from storm surge. But their ability to provide these services relies on the health and success of their young, and particularly those recruiting back to the reefs. But the young are already really vulnerable because they're going through developmental changes that are really energetically expensive. So that's why I'm interested in understanding how additional environmental stress can affect the way that young oysters develop. And in this example that I have here, I have two populations of baby oysters, which are called larvae. And they're experiencing two different water conditions. One that's considered average, present day, current, not as stressful. And then the other that's acidic and pretty stressful for oysters. So by the end of the larval stage, we see that those that experience those stressful waters are much smaller than those that experience less stress. But I'm really interested in understanding how this pattern might affect them later in their life, which is called a carryover effect. So carryover effects, in this case, you can see that even though the juvenile oysters are now experiencing the same or similar water conditions, those that experience those more acidic waters are still smaller. But why might this be, or why do carryover effects occur? And one hypothesis is that it's due to an energy deficit that occurs during that early life stage. So here as an example, we have an oyster that's experiencing average, normal water conditions. And it's healthy, it's strong, it's able to divide its energy evenly between these important aspects of their biology. So growth and reproduction, which are really important to the fitness or the prolongation of an oyster in their population, but more importantly, that maintenance category. And the maintenance category you can think of as the survival category. So it's just all of the functions and the molecules that are absolutely necessary for an oyster to continue to survive. Now it's experiencing an acidic and a stressful environment, and it has to shift its energy towards that maintenance category and away from those other aspects of growth and reproduction. So in order to survive, they're having to take away from those other important categories. So now if we go back to my example from earlier, where we have those larvae that are experiencing that acidic condition and they're much smaller, they're probably smaller because they're shifting that energy away from growth and towards just surviving and maintaining. And just like the Got Milk commercials taught us when we were younger, that in order for us to be healthy adults, we depend on the experiences while we're young. That's exactly what the carryover effects hypothesis states, that those that experience less stress earlier on have the energy to continue the population forward, whereas those that experience more stress earlier on might not have energy necessarily to survive. So I'm really interested in understanding these carryover effects and how that affects the population of oysters. And in particular, this is important for future climate change studies because you can imagine that we use juvenile oysters from either of these populations, we conduct a study on them, we might get different results, and now we have an inconclusive understanding of what might happen to oysters in the future. So this summer, I was able to look at the larval stage, particularly how acidification was affecting their aspects of their biology. And compared to those that were raised in non-acidic or normal water conditions, those that did experience that stress earlier on did actually end up being a lot smaller in size than those that were less stressed, indicating that we might have a shift in that towards that maintenance category, towards survival. So I looked at some compounds that were really important to combating the stress or the damage from that stress, and I did actually find that there was a significant amount of these molecules that are really important. And so that indicates that they actually are shifting away from growth and towards just maintaining. So this summer, I'm hoping to understand how that might affect them as juveniles. So, to be continued. Thank you.